Hello, everybody, and welcome to the General Eclectic Podcast with Brad Dreer. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and as we make our way through the pre-Christmas season, I think some Christians call that Advent, although you probably wouldn't know it too much to watch the TV or listen to things or scroll your Twitter. The Christmas season actually doesn't begin until the 25th, but at any rate, we're getting there. And I always tell myself, Rod, that once we get to the pink candle in Advent, which is the third week, then I can sort of, I feel my conscience is clean with which I can start to think and talk about Christmas. So now, how are you preparing for the season there in Budapest, my friend?
Well, funny you asked that. I just swooped in. It's late at night when we're recording this, but my friend Anna invited me to go with her tonight to hear Handel's Messiah performed at the Franz Liszt Academy. And I got to tell you, man, it was just, I'm still high coming home from that. It was the perfect thing. As you and our regular listeners know, I haven't had a very good year. But just to be there in that beautiful old world concert hall and to hear these people singing the Messiah, it just lifted my heart. I mean, because I know I didn't realize how much I knew of it by heart just from having listened to it.
Yeah.
I mean, when they got to the Hallelujah chorus, I wanted to stand up because you know how we all have that tradition.
That is,
They don't do it here. They don't know anything about it. I had to explain to Anna. I said, we stand in English-speaking countries, and here's why, because the King of England, blah, blah, blah. And when the Hallelujah chorus came, I wanted to pop straight up, but then I didn't want to make it hard for the people standing behind me to see because they don't know anything about it. I saw one man in the whole hall down in the front row stand up. I'm like,
dude, legend. That's so good.
Stand for me, brother. But it was just so great because the music was so beautiful and I just got so into it. Kale, I thought, this is really true. What they're singing about is true. I know that my Redeemer liveth. And, I've heard the Messiah many times, but this year was special. And I remember I was feeling so full of joy and such grace from heaven in that music. And with those people, I thought, man, I'm a stranger here, but these are my people tonight. They really are.
Yeah. That's so great. Now, the audience should know you did share a quick picture of me, a short little video clip of it. Boy, that hall looked beautiful, man.
Oh, it was.
I mean, it was like old school, old fashioned, just gorgeous, huh?
Yeah, it's the old world for sure. The thing I sent to you, it's I experienced what they call iron clapping here.
Iron clapping.
Iron clapping.
Help me out.
Yeah. Well, I asked Anna. Everybody, it was when the thing was over. They were clapping like crazy, but then everybody started in unison, clap, 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 clap. I thought, and it just kept going on and on and on. And I asked Anna. I said, "Is this a Hungarian thing?" She said, "Oh yeah, it's a legacy from communism. It's called iron clapping." They were taught if you really love a performance, everybody has to clap in unison.
That is just so wild. Look, you'll be happy to know, or perhaps our listeners in Budapest will be happy to know that kind of thing happens from time to time in a high school environment, but it is a very ironic slow clap, is what we call it. It's like da 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 da, and it's not a compliment. Usually, it's usually done with a certain amount of shade, as the kids would say.
Well, maybe that's what I was thinking this was, but she was like, "Oh no, that's when you really love something, you iron clap." It was so cool to be a foreigner here and to participate, and the whole thing was sung in English, of course, which Handel wrote it in English. The libretto was in English, but they had super titles in Hungarian. Very strange language.
Well, I was just going to add, it's funny you bring that up and, whatever, we can get to what we get to. But everybody says, of course, and you've said this too, that Hungarian is a very difficult language for a non-native speaker to understand and to learn. are you getting to where you can kind of hear some things?
Oh hell no! Oh hell no, man! It is like it is like Klingon, and
right, right,
but they're so proud of their language, and rightly
yeah,
so, because this is
yeah,
you really understand. I think when you live in a country where nobody else speaks their language. I mean, even Polish, other people speak Polish outside of Poland.
sure,
Nobody speaks Hungarian outside of Hungary. And you realize how much this language means to the people here. It is who they are. And I just felt like I was led into some kind of family thing tonight, but not only a family thing, but the music, of course, it's Handel's Messiah. And again, it's in English by a German composer. This is one of the great treasures of the West. Sure. And, I try not to get stuck in culture war mode, but I remember sitting there thinking, there are people in our country who would hear this and be like, it's white Western male. But I'm like, just get on down the street.
Whiteness, man. It's whiteness. I mean, whiteness is just this sort of catch-all term for, pardon my expression, but shit we don't like.
Yeah.
It's it's a weird thing.
It is a weird thing, because if we were sitting, you and I, in New Orleans, and we heard like a performance of something Duke Ellington wrote, Black composer writing in a predominantly Black idiom, we would consider that to be something that belonged to all of humanity. It was an expression of the genius of Black Americans at a certain time in our history, but it belonged to all of us, to all Americans, to the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, like Rod, like one of the great, to me, the underappreciated but the great achievements of the United States of America is jazz. And like I don't play jazz. I listen to jazz, but and it may be partly because I'm from New Orleans and I sort of have an attachment to it that way. But like it is what a great contribution to the Western genius, and it's not mine technically. You know what I mean?
No,
but it's ours.
But it is yours. It is ours, and it belongs to the world. I was listening last night. I was up really late doing some writing, and I had a Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald Christmas album on. And I was thinking, man, Louis Armstrong belongs to the world, one of the great men of the 20th century, and just so full of joy. And it's a joy that comes from New Orleans. That is a Black man from New Orleans, but he was a citizen of the world. And if you don't love Louis Armstrong, you are perhaps subhuman. Something's wrong with you.
Yeah, you're doing it wrong, man. You're doing it wrong.
But yeah, tonight, what a great night. Anna, my friend, and my coworker at the Danube Institute, she leaned over and said, people are so starved for beauty, because she was talking about the way the audience just went crazy for this performance. And I don't know that it was a spectacular performance as these things go, but it was so beautiful. And you can tell I'm on top of the world. I just floated in here.
Yeah, we got a little Happy Rod. Now Happy Rod, now where are we headed? What's up here? Because we're recording. Audience should know we're recording a couple of days early than we typically do, because you are off and about. So what's up next?
Yeah, I'm leaving for Rome in the morning. I've got 3 days in Rome. I'm doing some at least one interview, maybe more, for my new book, the book about reenchantment. And I'm having lunch on Wednesday with Cardinal Pell, George Pell, in the Vatican. It's a social thing. I'm not interviewing him or anything, but we have a mutual friend. And the guy's a real hero of the faith. He was falsely accused of abuse. He was imprisoned, and he suffered for his faith. He suffered this unjust accusation, and he prevailed because he was finally let free. But he did not falter one bit, and I look forward to talking to him about that, because as you know, one of the big themes of Live Not by Lies is that we Christians have to prepare to suffer, and there's a man who did it. And
that's funny. I was literally just thinking about this. And if the audience will recall, Pell's mess in Australia overlapped with a lot of the McCarrick business, time wise. It was all in the wake of all that mess. And, so I was disinclined to sort of, pull for a bishop, so to speak. But I did a pretty big deep dive, because my first reaction was frankly kind of nasty. But I did a deep dive, and I looked into it. I remember even talking with you about it, and you're like, it doesn't. He seemed, even Rod Dreher, right?
Even
Was
Rod
like
Dreher.
this guy, like he's getting railroaded. Just looked too gross. And sure enough, it turned out to be so. But as you say, the man took it. I mean,
Yep.
he suffered. I mean, he was in solitary confinement, and it should also be pointed out to our audience, if they don't remember, he was not treated well. Like he was treated as if he were a high security, threat. So he wasn't, living in a halfway house, sipping on Mai Tais, with an ankle monitor on him. And he was deprived of. He wasn't allowed to say mass. He was what do they call it when you're separated from the rest of the prisoners? All these kind of things.
Yeah.
It was a mess.
It was. And my theory about what happened there, and I mean, I'm not going to be rude enough to ask him about it, but he had been appointed by Pope Francis to look into the Vatican Bank and try to clean up that mess. And suddenly he's charged in Australia with abusing a kid. And it was the most outrageous, just tissue thin accusation. But he had to go back. He faced trial. They convicted him. I had this view. I went to Australia a few years ago for to give a series of speeches and talk to people down there, and come to find out the Calabrian mafia in Italy, the I guess it's the province of Calabria. They are very, very strong in the Australian state of Victoria, which happens to be where Pell was charged, and it's the most anti-Catholic state in the whole country down there.
Wow.
It turns out, too, that the head of the Vatican Bank at the time Pell was looking into it was from Calabria. Now, that's not proof. That's circumstantial. But, things began to add up. And I talked to somebody else who worked under Pell doing that investigation. And she told me, she said, I knew before we got into that there was this homosexual network throughout the Roman Curia that was huge. And I also knew there was a whole lot of financial corruption. What I didn't know, she told me, until we started digging, was how closely the two are combined.
Right.
So, but anyway, Pell, thanks be to God, was vindicated. He's
barely. He was barely vindicated. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So anyway, I keep interrupting you.
No. But no, I'm just saying he is a real hero, and it is a grace and a blessing to be able to sit there and break bread with him on Wednesday. So, anyway, so
how long are you going to be there? You can be a couple of days. Is there a spot in Rome you always go to?
No.
Or?
I always go to where I can get the cacio e pepe, the pasta with cheese and black pepper. No, I'm going to be for the book. This time I'm going to go somewhere I've never been. I want to make a point of going to the space under the altar at St. Peter's, the high altar, which is where Peter himself is buried.
Yeah.
They only discovered this like a few years ago.
Yeah, it was not very long ago, actually. It was not very long ago.
10, 15 years ago?
No, I think it's more like 25, to be fair. But,
really? Okay.
But it's not like, centuries ago. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, they were digging down there, and they saw that there was a grave and a bunch of other graves were ordered around it. When they kept digging, they saw an inscription that said, "Peter is here."
Yeah.
And of course, they left him there. And I hope to go there and, pay my respects, pray there. And
well, this picks up with our theme from last time. We were talking about the ancient we forget the ancient substructure upon which our faith is based, and out of which our faith comes, right? And you've been we talked a little bit about it last week with your trip to Turkey and into the seven churches of Revelation, and you've been blogging about this. And I wanted to ask you a question. I know you always think that you just said it all in the post, and it's certainly one of those classic read the whole thing Rod Dreher posts. But I mean, what are you seeing in this research that you've been doing that you feel is really a kind of clarion call for us to remember here in the present time?
Well, we talked a little bit about this last week, but since our last recording, I read a really interesting book by an American historian named Kyle Harper. Excuse me. It's called From Sin to Shame. And what it is, it's about sexuality in first century Roman Empire. Oh, there you have it.
I found it in my library. How cool is that? Huh?
Wow, yeah. So it's and it's about the way sex was treated in the Roman Empire when Christianity appeared, how radically different the Christian view of sex, which came out of Judaism, was to polytheistic pagan Rome, and how when the empire switched over to becoming Christian, how radically it changed everything. And the thing that I just hadn't really not understood because I don't know enough history is how when the Christians appeared, the early church, they were so implacably opposed to the Roman sexual mores because the sexual mores were the thing on which the entire economy and the entire society and the religion were founded. To be precise, and this is something that if you heard last week's podcast, you don't know this because I just learned it the other day from reading Kyle Harper. The slavery, of course, was everywhere in ancient Rome. There were lots of slaves. But what I didn't realize is how closely Roman sexual exploitation was tied in with the slave trade. So in ancient Rome, it was not as many people like to think, oh, the French Quarter with togas. Everybody
I love that
was
line. Yeah, that's a great line that you put in the piece. The piece, by the way, is linked below in the show notes right now. But that line that we have this sort of really gauzy, low res conception, like everybody was just having a blast in ancient Rome. It's Mardi Gras with togas, except it's not.
So no, not at all. If you were a freeborn male, you were king of the world. You could do anything you want. Yeah. You could put your wing into any person you want as long as it wasn't another man's wife or your own kids. But
of your social class.
Of your social class, yeah.
Right.
But slaves, male or female, kids, slaves were there for you to sexually use and abuse. And, what's so interesting, Kyle Harper points this out, is that it wasn't gender. That was not the division that in Roman sexual mores. It was all about social status and class. Right. And if you were a man, you could do whatever you wanted, but you could not be penetrated. You could not be the passive male sexual partner. So those who were just despised. So you have a lot of people today who like to read back queer theory into ancient Rome. No. If you were a sexually passive male, then you were the lowest of the low. But it happened all the time. And of course, if you were a slave, nobody cared about you anyway. There was a line.
I mean, you just didn't matter, right? And I think that this picks up something we had talked about. I don't want to just sort of insert it back into the conversation, but the radical idea that we are image bearers of the divine. I mean,
exactly.
The idea, the concept of that is we Christians or non-Christians in 2022 basically take that for granted.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
As if, well, obviously that's true. And I remember one time listening to a Jordan Peterson podcast or something, and he was just going off on the whole idea of law and the imago Dei. And he makes the point, is like, this idea it's a miracle because it is in no way self-evident. Right. Yeah. What is actually self-evident is the kind of default red and tooth and claw nature that we can see, all around us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Tom Holland, in his great book, Dominion, makes the same point, that everything we think of today, even if you are an atheist and a sexual libertine, the world you move in, the things you carry around in your head, the whole idea of consent, that did not exist in ancient Rome. Consent didn't matter if you were a slave, a woman, or a male slave. If you were a Roman woman married to a man, you had very strict socially determined roles. You couldn't go out and sleep with whoever you wanted to, but your husband could, and you couldn't do anything about it.
Right. There was no standing. That is correct.
Right.
But what I'm struck with this, the the Harper book, or the things that you've been pulling out of the Harper book, is that Holland makes that point, but he's really talking more about the kind of the violence, sort of the morality of violence and like kind behavior, right? Basically like this. But what he really seems to draw out is actually the connection to slavery and the dark side of sexuality, right?
Exactly. And as Kyle Harper points out, slavery, the whole Roman economy was built on slavery.
Yeah.
And the connection between slavery and sexual abuse was rife. Kyle Harper talks about Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers. He was right there in the port city of Alexandria, and he would see ships unloading human cargo.
Yeah.
You know, all these women who were destined for the brothels. And he talked about how women would be sent into these brothels and they would be used and abused sexually until their bodies looked like corpses. This was normal in Rome. What broke it was Christianity. And you can see, but reading Harper, I mean, Harper's not writing as any sort of religious person. He's just a historian. But he, you can see why the slaves and the poor, why anybody who was not a freeborn Roman came to Christianity, because St. Paul, St. Paul was so rigid about sexuality because that was.
But why rigid? Yeah, why rigid though? I mean, that word, of course, has a lot of kind of fraught connotations in our discourse. But why do you use the word rigid, and why is that appropriate, and why might we rethink the word rigid? Maybe.
Yeah, because Paul was desperate to tell the people, the young churches in these places, do not assimilate yourself to these. To this evil. Your body is a temple of the Lord, as he says in Scripture. If you join your body to a prostitute, you are joining Christ to a prostitute. Right. Because it was, I mean, think about today.
And defiling the temple, right? I mean, so the notion is that you're defiling the temple.
Right. Paul and the first Christians who came out of Judaism still considered themselves to be a Jewish sect. Yeah. They believed that they connected pagan sexuality to idolatry, that if you lived according to pagan sexual rules, then you may as well, you're worshiping false gods. So for them, the purity of the body was an analog or the outward manifestation of a purity of spirit. Now, one thing that I don't want to overstate this, one of the things you find out when you read Harper's book to the end is the overreaction after the empire became Christian. The overreaction was pretty severe. I mean, they had some emperor, I forget which one it was, in the year 390 after the empire was Christianized. He passed a law outlawing male brothels, and he had all the male brothels emptied, and they burned the male prostitutes alive. Mm-hmm. Now, there's no way that can be reconciled with anything that we know of Christianity, but that's just how it was then. But it took a long time for them to get everything sorted. The overall point, though, Kale, is that we think today, it is presented to us that St. Paul he had a hang up about sex and hated the body, he this, he that. No, they looked around, Paul and the other Christians, and they saw what was being done to human beings. And this doesn't come up in Kyle Harper's book, but we also know that the Romans, they would just expose babies. You didn't want a baby, they just leave it out to die. Christians took care of babies. The Christians didn't practice abortion. And so the early church was a radical threat to the entire social and economic infrastructure of ancient Rome. Right. That's one reason they hated them. The Romans hated them. Right,
because in order for that economy to do its thing, it had to grind up the deplorables, right? In other words, it was predicated on being able to expose babies, right? It was predicated on getting rid of surplus population. It was predicated on being able to use people not as people, but as objects for gratification or for labor or whatnot. And those are the kinds of things that would horrify us, of course, naturally, whether you're a professing Christian or not in 2022, right? But what struck me today, Rod, as I was sort of preparing to talk with you today, is that, in podcasts past, we've talked a lot about like how we got here, right? And so we had a great conversation, for instance, with Carl Trueman, whose book Triumph of the what is it?
Something about the self. It was like kind of a boring title for a fantastic book, but the Strange New World is the abridged version.
The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
That's it.
Yeah, it's in the back. Yeah. So anyway, so we had a great conversation. We've kind of been talking about this, right? We're talking about the spend down, and we've talked about the sort of the cultural legacy of Christianity. Like, how long can it sort of hold things together if you don't have people who actually profess it and bear it out into the next generations? We've talked a lot about that. But we failed to consider, and I think this is why I've been so struck by what you've been writing about and talking about lately, is that we fail to understand how we got from the ancient world to a thing we call Christendom, right? And so much of the sort of post-Enlightenment, God is dead banter has been about, there's almost this sort of romantic attachment to a pre-Christian paganism. So you see this a little bit in the Romantic poets, and you see this certainly with Nietzsche, et cetera. And that, like, let's just get rid of this sort of Christian prudery, right?
It's the grass is greener thing.
It's a slave morality, and it's blah, blah. It's all those sorts of things, which is an interesting comment, right? Because it actually is, because it's the antidote to the power and abuse morality of the ancient world, right? And so therefore the Tom Holland portion of it, I think, is another important part that he brings out in Dominion, is that there is no such thing as separation of church and state. The church and state were one. And in fact, you could argue that the default mode is always a kind of singularity between church and state. And I think we're actually returning to a version of sort of the integration of church and state. The problem is that for you and me is that it's not the church that we.
It's not our church.
No. Right.
No, it's. That's wokeness. We keep saying it is a form of religion. It is a secular religion, as Bolshevism was, a political religion. It has sacred values, and those values are not our values.
Right.
Right.
So anyway, just real quick, but so the Holland portion of it, though, is important because, we have sort of kid ourselves. He talks about, Harper, you can talk about Holland in a second, but he talks about the movement from shame to sin. It's a movement from a sort of a public facing sense of social morality to a private one, right? So you can see the sort of the development of the whole idea of free will and the conscience that we see worked out in Christianity. And we forget, the sort of the roots of this. And you made the point too, Rod, that, no wonder, Christianity became hugely popular first amongst the shat upon classes who were not people in the Roman regnum.
Yeah, and go forward to the United States, the slaveholding states in America in our time. In a Christianized society, the very idea that Christians in the South could hold slaves, and they treated the slaves the same way the Romans did.
Yep.
Same thing. They did not see the image of God in those people, and I believe the Civil War was a judgment of God on the South, on our home region, because of that. But but I think what's so weird about it, Kale, is we are recapitulating now. We are going back. We're being repaganized. It's not going to be the same thing as Roman paganism, because we've been through Christianity. You can't go back to exactly what they had. But look, when you
I'm being.
Think about pederasty. When you read the Kyle Harper book, you understand how integral pederasty was to Roman male society. And they saw children as sexual beings there to be used by the strong. Well, here we are today, seeing our children sexualized in the name of LGBT rights, in the name of safety and tolerance and all that. And now we're even starting to see some people talk, academics, it always starts in academia, talk about maps, The
Maps.
minor
What is map?
attract.
Well, we like maps, right? And we like to
Nah.
know where we're going. What are you talking about?
No,
Roger?
what was that? Minor
Maps.
attracted
Persons.
right?
Minor attracted persons. What do we used to?
Pedophiles.
Pedophiles. Thank you. I think that's what we used to call them.
That's what we. Yeah,
I think we still call them that.
yeah, but they're changing the language to take the sting out of it. The thing that I got from reading the Harper book is how human sexuality really is fluid, more fluid than I realized. Because
And what do you mean by that? Right? Break this down.
because desire is inchoate. I mean,
yeah.
you desire what you want. You desire what you desire. It has to be socially channeled in some way. In ancient Greece and Rome, thou shalt not. You might desire another man's wife, but you couldn't have her. You might be a freeborn man. You might desire to have sex with a slave boy. You could have him. That was permitted. Christianity set very strong parameters on what was permitted and what wasn't, licit expressions of sexuality and illicit ones. Well,
so in other words, a kind of forming of that powerful thing towards some kind of norm.
Right. And as Uncle Sigmund Freud taught us,
right.
You have to. Civilization is not possible until and unless you can govern the sexual instinct. The Romans and the Greeks had their own way of doing it. Christians had a different way of doing it. Well, we have cast aside the Christian way of doing it. Philip Rieff, I never tire of saying this, in The Triumph of the Therapeutic, 1966, Philip Rieff, secular Jew, said that Christians had no idea how integral their sexual morality was to the entire Christian social imaginary in the early church. Well, they're about to find out, he said, because he said this at the beginning of the sexual revolution. And he said it's a real question as to whether or not you can keep Christianity without Christian sexual morality. And so many Christians today, I mean, you see it in your church, you see it in my church, you're starting to see it among the evangelicals. Yeah. They don't understand, why do we have to follow all these strict rules about governing homosexuality or heterosexuality? What does it have to do with worshiping God, with having Jesus in our hearts? Well, guess what? Read some history and you'll find out it has everything to do with the imago Dei.
It's funny though, because it seems like when I hear people talk that way, right? Contemporaries of ours, friends of ours talk that way, it's sort of this strange kind of carve out for privacy, right? That, what does it matter, Rod, Kale, like, what does it matter what, Jim does in the privacy of his own home? Mm-hmm. But the whole notion of having a privacy of one's own, which is a kind of stand-in for my conscience, right, or my sort of private world, is in fact a kind of Christian technology.
Sure.
Right? The whole notion of having this sort of private sphere is itself something birthed by the Christian worldview.
Exactly. And Kyle Harper's book is called From Shame to Sin. Well, we are now going from sin to shame. Yeah. The whole idea that whatever you do in private is your own business and nobody else can pass judgment. That is.
Yet I have to proclaim, Rod. I have to proclaim my pronouns. I have to proclaim my celebration of all things LGBTQ+. I have to bear the banner. Like, it's an oddly public performative requirement, isn't it?
Well, it is, and the idea is that the only thing that the standard by which we judge sexual behavior is, aside from consent, which is a very a free will thing. I'll get into that in a second.
Yeah.
But it's about shame. That whatever you can do. I mean, the whole pride thing, right? LGBT pride. It's called pride because this is refuting the idea that you should be ashamed of your same-sex sexual desires. I get that. I know why they do that. But this, what it means is, and this is something I get from reading Kyle Harper, is that it is a reversion to shame. Like, you do not have to be ashamed of your desires in a society in which pride is the high holy day. And this is where we live today, and it is a repaganization. There's no doubt about it. About the free will thing, Kyle Harper says that the early church invented free will. what does he mean by that? It doesn't make, I mean, I thought it was just something that was just natural. No. In the pagan world, the Greco-Roman pagan world, everybody thought that fate was determinative, that the stars, your fate was written in the stars. And so it was a way of saying that people who were slaves, well, they deserved it. It was their fate to be slaves. But early Christianity, and St. Paul, you see this in the Bible, they said that no, every single person has the moral choice. You are morally responsible because you are free. Now, Harper goes on to say that as the church grew and became more assimilated or more widespread throughout society, they had to realize, and the church fathers had to deal with the fact that what kind of free will does someone who is forced into prostitution have? And the theology began to change. But the important point is that it was with the advent of Christianity in the first century that modern notions of free will, which we all take for granted, which is the thing that informs the whole idea of consent for sexuality, it came out of Christianity.
Yeah, it's a wild thing. I've mentioned to you before the Canterbury Tales, and the first big story is called The Knight's Tale. And in The Knight's Tale, you've got two cousins who are vying for the hand of Emily, the beautiful maiden, right? And each of them, the night before the big contest, each of them, you have a scene where they pray to the god for help in their situation. And one prays to the god of love, and this is Venus, of course, not Jesus or Yahweh, the God of love, because he loves Emily, right? And I want to be with and so he prays to that. The other one prays to the God of war because he wants victory in the battle so that he can win Emily's hand. But Emily significantly prays to Diana, the goddess of chastity. And I remember for years just reading the story and not exactly understand, like, God, it's just like she kind of gets like, what's the deal with that? And then it occurred to me just a couple of years ago, she's praying for autonomy to determine her own future. Yeah. Right. And so Diana is the goddess of chastity, because it seems, it's still, even for people like you and me, it strikes it's so kind of prudish and kind of like, sort of scoldy, but absolutely not. It's all about, I want the freedom to determine my own, my own destiny in this sense.
Yeah. And women in ancient Rome did not have that.
No, none of that. Right. And like even that, the deep irony, right? Because the trouble that the church often gets in the sort of the withering critiques of feminism, it's like, well, actually, the church, confers a whole status that basically didn't exist prior to it, which is a point that's completely overlooked, almost entirely.
Well, I had a really interesting thing happen earlier today. I think you might remember that there's a production team that's putting together the film, a documentary version of Live Not by Lies. And they're raising money now, and they just got a director attached to it. And so we had a Zoom meeting with the producers and this guy. And it was kind of a get to know you thing, because I hadn't met this director yet. And I was just talking to the guys about the trip to Turkey and about going to Ephesus and Pergamum, what I learned about the early church, and how the entire book of Revelation is a message to tell the early church, get ready to suffer. You're going to have to bear a lot of pain and death for the sake of the kingdom, but be strong, because the victory is already over. As we were talking about this, I was listening to the young director talk about the things that stood out to him most about Live Not by Lies, which is the story of the church under communism and how they stood out. And he said, yeah, the whole idea of suffering for the sake of truth. And that was really big. Then I said, wait a minute. We need to start this movie by going to Turkey, by going to Ephesus, and by going to Pergamum. Pergamum being the Roman administrative center, where Jesus said in the beginning of Revelation, speaking through the St. John, he said that the throne of Satan is there in Pergamum, which is to say the Roman Empire is what the devil is using to rule the world. It is the seat of iniquity. And these early Christians had to stand tiny and alone, except for God and each other, against the entire might of the Roman Empire. And Revelation was sent, the whole book of Revelation was a message to them to tell them to stand firm. And we decided that, once we get production underway, we'll probably start the thing out not in Moscow or Warsaw or Budapest, one of the communist capitals, but we'll go right back to where the early church was and where they had to stand firm and learn how to suffer to be a witness and a resistor and a dissident to the might of Rome. That is what we're starting to face right now. And I'm jabbering, Kale, but I know we're running out of time. But let me just finish right here. Now I lost my chain.
You were talking about the idea of Rome as this massive, machine-like reality that creates a kind of reality. It has certain demands. It has certain things that it wants to accomplish. And Christians, clearly, this small, irrelevant little, one-off of a Jewish sect challenges the very operating system that it kind of represents.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. So in the blog post that you liked so much, I talk at the very end about a book that I recommend to everybody called The Final Pagan Generation by Edward J. Watts. And what Watts does, he's a historian. He goes in and he examines the writings of the Roman elites of the 4th century. The 4th century was when the empire transitioned. That was the hinge point from pagan to Christian. I mean, Constantine converted in 315, but the empire didn't really start to become Christian until the end of that century. What Watts says is that he talks about the fighting that started to take place around in the late 4th century, around 390 or so. The Christian mob in Alexandria burned the Serapeum, which is a major pagan temple, because they were angry because a pagan mob had attacked them. What Watts says is the younger men, pagan and Christian of that time, they knew what time it was back then. They knew that things were changing. The pagan men said, we're about to lose all this. We better fight back. The Christian men thought, you know what? The younger ones said, we've almost got this. If we just give it a little more of a push, our order, we'll be in control. The older men, pagan men that Watts writes about, they just couldn't fathom it. They thought, well, the temples are open. Rome has always been pagan. It always will be. They didn't see what was coming. I emphatically believe that that's where we Christians are today. We don't see how our quote unquote empire is shifting radically into a post-Christian and indeed anti-Christian neo-pagan philosophy. And if we Christians, this is my mission, I feel, that if we don't wake the hell up and understand what time it is, to use the Claremont Institute's great phrase, we're going to be as wiped out as the pagans were.
Right. And I think what I'm getting from you is that, it wasn't always so. Right. And therefore it won't necessarily always be. And we take so much of these sort of things for granted. But I tell you, what gives me hope as I'm reading this stuff and listening to you talk. And, we talked about Louise Perry's book, a couple of weeks back. And, there's a lot of sort of people are kind of realizing in their own respective spheres that something is wrong.
Yeah.
Something is amiss with all this, that the way we've been trying to sort of have our cake and eat it too, have a culture, but drain it of all of its spirit and energy and soul. We're not in a place where we can just sort of do this anymore. We really can't take, everything for granted the way that we've been taking for granted. So I don't know. I mean, I'm oddly, Rod, I'm just oddly kind of jazzed by the fact that a lot of these things are sort of becoming clear and more clarified for me and hopefully for others, even as we just sort of talk this stuff out loud.
Oh God, Kale, you're becoming hopeful.
I know it. This is not who took me? This is a fake Kale.
Let me say this then. We're Christians and we don't believe in fate. Our history is not fated. It doesn't have to go the way it's going. But if we sit back passively and allow this stuff to roll over us, allow powerful people who run our institutions to roll over us, then it will happen. I mean, I think Yoel Roth, the weirdo who was the head of St.
but he's not a weirdo. See, here's the thing, Rod, and I know we're running out of time and we're going to have to do this later on, but I might even write something about this. He's not a weirdo. He is the perfect expression of the degeneracy of our meritocracy.
Sure.
He is perfect, right? He is a condensed symbol, as you like to say. He is a condensed symbol of exactly our decadence.
Of course. Well, for those who haven't been following, he was, until Elon Musk fired him, the head of safety at Twitter. And it turns out it was he who was in touch with like the FBI and the government, making these decisions to shadow ban and kick people off and suppress news that would be harmful to the progressive narrative, especially the transgender narrative. He's a gay man, educated, Ivy League education. UPenn. His doctoral thesis was about gay sex hookup apps. And he even talked at one point about how, we really should be thinking about making these things possible for minors to use. So how does a guy with a set of opinions that would have gotten him arrested within living memory, he rises to the top to become one of the most powerful figures governing speech in the United States and indeed the world?
Banning a sitting president from the app. I mean, it's like a crazy parable. It's a crazy parable, Rob.
It is a crazy parable, but this is the thing that ordinary people, normies, need to wake up and understand. As you say, Yoel Roth, as weird as his own values are, he's not weird among the elites. He's what they want. Right. They want woke people like him, and it matters. Institutional capture really matters. And this is something you and I talk about a lot, but Yoel Roth, the lesson of Yoel Roth at Twitter is an example of what happens when morally and spiritually corrupt people gain control of key institutions. It's happening everywhere. Right. And I'll leave you with this bomb, Kale, because I can't really talk a lot about it yet because I'm working this out with the guy, but since you and I talked last, I made contact with a scholar in this country or in the United States who was heavily involved in the occult as a practitioner and also a researcher, academic researcher. Very, very, very heavily involved. And I'm interviewing him for a chapter in my book about negative enchantment, which is to say the dark side of enchantment. Yep. And the stuff this guy was telling me about networks of the occult and of sexual abusers, the sexual abuse of people, especially children, is an integral part of high-level satanic worship. And he was telling me, I got his name, I've checked him out, he is who he says he is. He was telling me that, think about conspiracy theory, because this is one of the things he studies academically. He said, many conspiracies aren't theories. They're real, and you can connect the dots. The problem is the stuff that's actually real sounds so crazy that nobody wants to believe it. He said that, and some people who take 2 or 3 steps too far, they discredit the whole thing. But he said the Jeffrey Epstein network, that was a real thing. The sexual abuse of young women.
And trafficking and slavery.
Among the transnational elites. He said, Rod, that's real. And I don't want to get too deep into that in my work. That's not what my book is about. But, I talked to somebody else who knows something about that world, and I have to be super cagey about that. But this person was like, yeah. And this person told me just tonight, he's a cleric who is an exorcist. He said, well, when you see Cardinal Pell, tell him I think he's a spiritual hero because, and I also think that he, whether he knows it or not, was targeted by one of these high-level satanic networks. Yeah. So on that happy note, Kale, I'm off to Rome, and I'm going to go to St. Cecilia's, by the way, in Trastevere.
I've been there.
You have. It's great. St. Cecilia was a virgin martyr of, was it the 3rd century or 2nd century?
Yeah.
But man, we need her prayers. We need her prayers and her example.
That's exactly right. That's today. That's been my prayer is Saint Cecilia, pray for us. Ora pro nobis. So, all right, Rod. Look, I have a great trip to Rome. We'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. you.